Good afternoon then, and welcome along to this webinar from Oxford Professional Education Group on Harvard referencing. And what I want to talk through during this webinar is to give some guidance on some of the principles of referencing so that people understand a bit more about what it is and how to do it. And I'll also show you how to construct references and how to construct citations as well, because they are different from each other, but I'll point that out as we go through the course of the webinar and I'll highlight it to you. Plus there'll also be an opportunity to answer any questions about it that you might have as well. So the first thing I want to highlight is just to give some general background to referencing. And the first thing I want to do really is actually to set your mind at ease. Referencing is one of these things that it seems to utterly terrify students. And to be honest, I get it. I understand it. It's something that's emphasised so much to us when we're at university that it really does put this fear into us about how important it is and how it has to be done and how it has to be precise and all the rest of it. But actually, when it comes time to start to study your professional qualifications, there's a lot less emphasis on it that's needed than there was at university. Because the professional qualifications that you would be studying through the college, they put more emphasis on application rather than theoretical explanations. If you think of the approach that happened at university, so you started university when you were 18, 19 years old, something like that. And the truth is, you didn't understand the way the world operated. You didn't understand about work. You didn't understand how a lot of these concepts apply in the real world. But now you do. So there's a switch in emphasis away from that need to explain the theories and more towards how things work in reality, how the concepts get applied in a work situation that you find yourself in. So there's a different emphasis when it comes to referencing for professional qualifications than there is at university. But that fear that we got at university, that stays with us as we work our way through the professional qualifications instead. And hopefully, as I say, as I go through this, I'll be able to put your mind at ease a little bit on some of that. One of the other big background principles to referencing, the reason why it's there is if somebody was to read a document that you produced, they are going to assume that all of that is your own work, unless you illustrate which parts of it are not your work. So the aim of referencing is merely to show whether it's your work or whether it's someone else's idea that you're using and you're applying it to a situation. That's the broad principle behind it. It's the ability to show whether it's your work or whether it's somebody else's work that you then give credit to them for because they have given the idea or the formulation of your approach, if you like, that you have then built upon. So doing referencing, it's not in itself academically difficult. Because in effect, what you get is formula. You get templates, you get guides. It says, if it's a book, do it like this. If it's a conference, do it like this. And it's a bit like painting by numbers. You literally just fill in the sections in the template and your referencing will be correct. So in that context, it's not hard. It isn't academically difficult as such, but my word, it is very, very time consuming and it's very, very laborious. And that seems to be what really causes the problems. So although we might say it's hard and it's difficult and you've problems understanding it and all the rest of it, my theory is that actually it's the sheer amount of time and effort that's required to do it, and it comes with this fear-laden approach that we got from university. So there are all these different guides and formula that's available, and there's some on Oxcom Learning that you can look at, and depending on which professional qualification it is that you're studying, there's also individual guides to it as well that you can use for them as well. And it gives you the formula to follow through so that it does become a bit like painting by numbers in order to get your referencing correct. So let's start off then by looking at what needs to be referenced. What do you need to give a reference for? We'll make that the starting point and we'll work from there. So in short, going back to what I said was one of the aims of referencing in the previous slide, what you reference is anything that isn't your work. So the assumption is that anything that does not have some kind of reference attached to it is your own creation. Whereas if you've actually used somebody else's concept, let's say that you've used, say, some of Porter's work in order to help you to identify a strategy for the organisation. That idea was Porter's, not yours. What you have done is you have taken Porter's idea and applied it to a situation. So you have to give Porter the credit for the original idea that you are using in order to help you to work out what to do. So anything that doesn't have a citation or a reference attached to it, it will be assumed that it's totally your work, with nobody else's ideas contributing to it. Whereas if somebody has contributed some ideas or some thoughts or some statistics or assertions or opinions or a conference that you've been to where it was covered off or a presentation or a blog article that started you on a chain of thought, you need to give credit to that person for having started you on that train of thought as you work your way through it. So that's what you're aiming for. Unless it's something that's completely yours, totally your idea, you have to give a reference for it. So if it's, for example, statistics from the Office of National Statistics, for example, that would have a reference. If it's demographic information that you've got, that would have a reference. If it's market share figures that's come from market research, that would have a reference. So it's anything that's not fully your work. So assertions, opinions, statistics, etc., that would be classed as needing a reference for it. Now, this just emphasised the point I was making there. If you take a concept such as Porter's and you apply it to your organisation, that looks like, in your opinion, your work. But the original idea for something like Porter's came from Porter. So even if you're doing that and you're adapting it to the specifics of your organisation, that will also need to be referenced because it's been built on something else rather than it being an original idea from yourself. But one thing that you don't usually have to do, and I emphasise the point usually, and I'll explain why in a minute, is you don't have to give a reference for internal organisational data. Now the reason for that is if you look at most assignments that you might have to do, you're doing a work-based assignment as an employee or as if you were an employee for an internal audience, such as the board of directors or senior management. So this is an internal paper based on an organisation that everybody that reads it works for, and it's going to an internal audience that everybody else also works for. So in that sort of situation, you do not need to give referencing for internal organisational data. So if you've got your sales figures, for example, normally you would not need to give a reference for that sales data. However, if you then go on to compare your sales data to another organisation's sales data, then you would need to give a reference for that. Because where did you get that other organisation's sales data from? You're going to have had to get it from some kind of secondary research. So you need to give a reference for that. Now, one of the points I emphasised as I was talking it through there is I says, normally you don't need to give a reference for internal organisational data. But in some assignments that you work through for some subjects and some modules, because you're taking a different approach, you will need to include that. But generally, if it's an internal paper for an internal audience using internal organisational data, you don't have to give internal referencing for that. It's only for the external stuff or where it's somebody else's idea that you need to give it for. So some of the other general principles then. Let's just pick up this question actually. Would you say that a customer persona doesn't need to be referenced unless it is based on the theoretical framework? Yes, that would be my personal opinion. If it's your organization's own customer persona, you would not need to reference that. But the way that you would position that within an assignment is you would say the organization has created a customer persona. Therefore, in effect, you're illustrating that it is internal organizational data, and that would be absolutely fine. But if you've done it based on a theoretical framework that's come from another writer, you would have to give that writer the credit for them presenting the theoretical framework that you've then adapted it from. So you would then say, this has been adapted from the work of X, whoever it happens to be. Hopefully that answers your question. So some of the principles of referencing. First thing I want to highlight to it then, there are different kinds of reference. Different institutions, different professional bodies, different organizations will provide a different format for referencing. So there is no standard referencing format. There is no one way of doing it. Instead, and again, this is one of the areas that makes it difficult and confusing, and we get this, there is no standard way of doing it. There is only what individual organizations present. Now, a lot of the things that we do are for the Chartered Institute of Marketing. And the Chartered Institute of Marketing states it's Harvard. It's not footnotes, it's not APA, it's not any of the other derivations. It is Harvard, period. And Oxford Professional Education Group has also accepted and adopted that as our recommended approach, because that is the one that most organisations use, and it's fully accepted by most professional organisations as well. So the standard we use is Harvard. That doesn't mean Harvard is right, it merely means it's the standard that's been adopted. So you might look at other documents that have a different referencing structure. It doesn't make them wrong. What it means is they've adopted a different referencing structure. So what I'm going to do is I will give you the principles, and the guides that we provide are based on Harvard. And Harvard has no footnotes, it uses what's called citations, and the bibliography, and I'll show you the layout of them as I work our way through the webinar. But the standard that we use is Harvard. It doesn't mean that's right, it just means it's the one that's recommended. Other publications that you read might use a different format, and that's okay for them. So it's just understanding what the right format is for any particular paper you might be producing. So a Harvard referencing standard has two elements contained within it. The first element is what we refer to as a citation. And a citation is something that fits within the body of the document. And the generic format for it is always, in brackets, author, year. There's a couple of variations on that, which we'll highlight to you shortly. But generally, in-text citation and the format author, year. The second element of Harvard referencing is what's known as a bibliography. And the bibliography is a document at the end that gives a full extended citation for the documents and the publications that you have cited in your document itself. And again, there is a generic format that's used for that, which is what's listed here, where we have surname, initial, year of publication, title, edition number, place of publication, and publisher. So that's the template format, if you like, that's followed. I'm going to give you quite a few examples of these principles and how they look and how they're structured as we work our way through the rest of the webinar. But this is what I mean by saying that there is a generic format. And you do a painting by numbers job. You fill in the blanks based on these generic formats, and the formats are given in the guides that sit alongside it. The format guide that we use is one called Harvard. So basically you follow the Harvard rules, and the Harvard rules have these two elements. One, in-text citations which go in the document. Secondly, a list at the end called a bibliography. When you list the bibliography, as I say, it goes at the end of the document. What you should do is you should list it in alphabetical order based on the author's surname. So if you look at the generic structure of a Harvard reference entry in a bibliography, the first thing that's contained within it is the surname. So the order in which you present the bibliography is in surname order. You don't split it by media, so you don't split it by books, journals, websites, etc. Some referencing standards do, but not Harvard, which is why sometimes you might look in a document that does split it that way, and then you get tutors that come along and say, no, you don't do it like that. You have to list it in alphabetical order. And that's why. It's because under Harvard rules, it's listed in alphabetical order by surname, not split by media types or anything else like that. Now, here's a really important point for you. If you remember, I mentioned 10-15 minutes ago or so, I said that Harvard and referencing is not difficult, but it is incredibly time-consuming and laborious. So the top tip, what students often do is they wait until they've finished their assignment and then they go back and they fill in all the references. Wrong. That is what makes it difficult. The easiest way to do it, and the way it becomes more complete and it becomes more comprehensive, is to do it as you go along. It's as you produce the document. Because if you think about the process of producing an assignment document, and let's say it's like a 4,000 word assignment document that you're producing. So you start typing things up, and then 3 months down the line, when it now comes time to finish it off, you've got to try and remember what the full details were of something that you looked up 3 months ago and that you've included within your assignment. That becomes a complete nightmare. Whereas if you record all of your citations and all of your bibliography entries as you go along, as you find them, as you include them, as you're producing your assignment-based work, it makes the job much, much easier for you than trying to backfill it when you're finished. It really is much, much easier to do that. And anybody that's done assignments will probably testify to this. It makes life much, much easier if you do it on an ongoing basis rather than trying to do it when you've finished. So let me go through some specifics about giving in-text citations and then how you give the Harvard referencing entry in the bibliography. As I said, there's the two elements to the referencing approach. We'll start with citations and then we'll talk about the bibliography entry. So, in-text citations. You have two broad ways of doing it. One is that it's in addition to the text. So what you then have is you have the surname of the author and the year in brackets after you say the relevant text. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. Or alternatively, you build that citation in as part of the words that you've included within the document. So you might say, according to Roberts, there are two ways of citing. And you can see the name I've used, Roberts, because that's my name. So I'm just using that as an example. So if you incorporate the citation as part of the text, it will look like this. So according to author surname, brackets, year. And then you go on to finish the sentence. Or alternatively, you finish the sentence and you have brackets, Roberts, and year. So you structure it that way. And this is an important point. You do not need anything more than that for an in-text citation. And anything more that you do give is wasting words. Now, many assignments that you do will have a word count or a page count. Therefore, you are limited as to how much you can give. So if you don't write the in-text citation in the correct way, you waste words. And that means that you've reduced the amount of space that you've got to include other content which will give you marks. So here's an example of what I mean by that. A report on referencing was written by, and then you give the in-text citation that explained the two ways of doing a citation. It's very wasteful of word count. It's a very wasteful way of structuring it. It's much more effective to just say there are two ways of doing a citation. Brackets, Roberts 2019. Much quicker, much easier, less words, less space. Sometimes you will also use what we call secondary referencing. So this is the situation where perhaps you've read a textbook and the textbook talks about another writer's work. So you've read a textbook by somebody that talks about Porter's generic strategies, for example. The way you do that is you give the citation for the author of the book that you've read. You give that first. So Roberts 2018. And then you give the place where you read it. So you now give the second author. So this would be like Porter 2005 cited in Smith 2019, or whatever it happens to be. That's absolutely fine to do that. So if you've read about somebody else's work in a book, that's the way that you give the citation for it. For every citation that you've got in your text, you need to have an entry in the bibliography. But even if you give a citation, say 5 times within the text, and each time you use somebody else's work, even if it's the same piece of work that you used earlier on, each time you use it, you have to give a citation every single time within the document. So you might give the same citation 6 times in a document. That would be fine and correct. But you only give one entry in the bibliography for that citation. Now, if you give a slightly different citation, so say it was the same author but they've done different pieces of work, and that you're using those different pieces of work, you would have to give an entry in the bibliography for each of those different pieces of work. But if it's the same piece of work, which you cite on multiple occasions, one entry in the bibliography is fine, but you need to make sure that for every in-text citation you give, there is an entry in the bibliography that goes with it. Another common question that comes up is whether page numbers should be included within an in-text citation. And the answer to that is yes and no. When you give a page number is when you have given a direct quotation. So if there was a direct quotation in an assignment that said there are 2 ways of citing a document. So in other words, what you've done is you have copied my words. So if you read a book and you copied the words from that book and put them into your assignment, you would have to give a page number for that. So you would give, there are 2 ways of citing a document according to Roberts, brackets, 2019, and then the page number of the book where that direct quotation came from. But if it wasn't a direct quotation, you don't need to give the page number. So if it's a direct quote in quote marks, you give the page number. If it's not, you don't. That's one of the rules. Another one, perhaps what you've done is you've read a book by multiple authors, and this happens quite often. You know, there's Johnson, Whittington, Scholes, there's Hooley, Nicoload, and various other writers. There's lots of people that contribute to one book, and you then need to give a citation. So the other question is, do you give a citation for every single author? No is the answer to that. Not in the in-text citation anyway. For multiple authors, what you do is you use the words et al, which basically means and others. It's Latin for and others. So what you would say is Roberts et al, and then the year, rather than giving the surnames of all of the different authors. If you give the surnames in the bibliography entry, not in the citation. Websites is another area that sometimes cause problems with giving citations, because the rule is author and year. Well, what if it's from a web page and that web page does not have an author? So the way you get around that is you either give the top level domain or you give the organisation that produced the web page. So for example, if I'd read about something in the BBC, I could give BBC 2019 or www.bbc.co.uk. Then the full details of the website would go in the bibliography, not in the document. Okay? So as I say, there are some rules that you follow for doing in-text citations, and these are the broad rules of it. Some of the specifics and some of the interesting situations that you come across, the details of them will be given within the formula and the guides that you might read. But these are the broad principles of it. So remember as well, 2 elements to Harvard referencing. One is the in-text citation, the other one is the bibliography. So let me show you some elements of what goes into a bibliography and how you do that. And the first point I would highlight is that there are 2 ways of doing a bibliography. One is what's called a bibliography, and one is what's called a references list. Normally, you don't need both unless specifically asked for. The difference between the 2 is a references list contains only those entries for which you've given a citation in the document. A bibliography is everything that you have consulted, whether you've given a citation for it or not. So if you do a bibliography, it will, by definition, have all of the citations from the document contained within it, because you have to have consulted it in order to have given a citation within the document. But a bibliography will have more, because it will have documents there and books there that you have read and consulted and looked at, but that didn't make it into the assignment as a citation. So bibliography is generally preferred to a references list. You don't need both, just one. It's a bibliography that you give. The entry is the same. You don't need to split your bibliography either into citations or references and into others that were consulted. You just give one big long list based on author surname. When you're doing, or when you've got a secondary reference, so for example, when I'd said in the previous slide, Robert cited in Smith, the question is which one do you give the entry in the bibliography to? It is the cited in author that you give. So in the example before where it said Robert cited in Smith, you give it for Smith, not for Roberts. Because what you're doing is you're giving the entry for where you got the information. And you didn't get the information from the original work of Roberts. You got your information from the work of Smith. And therefore, that is what you give the credit for. You give the credit for Smith because that's who wrote the book. So it's whoever you said was cited in. That's who gets the entry. Now, this is the generic format that's used as I presented earlier, and here it is again. This is how you lay it out. There are some variations that take place on that, because there are different kinds of publications that don't quite fit that formula. And this is where the guides are used. So you look up the guide and you can see the specifics for what it is you might be doing, just to be precise on how you do it. But again, the generic format, surname, initial for all of the authors, the year, title of the publication, if it's a book and it has an edition number, place of publication, and a publisher. So you can start to see when you look at that how some of these subtle differences would come in. What do you do for a conference? What do you do for a presentation? It doesn't have those kinds of things. One specific one that has these different formats is websites, and how you give a website entry in a bibliography. And I'll show you some examples of how you do it in a minute, but again, the guides will show you exactly what it is you do. Another point to be aware of, if you don't know the author, and again, this is one that often applies to websites, if you don't know the author, you give a non in the bibliography. So in your in-text citation, you're given the top-level domain or the organization address. Whereas in the bibliography, you give a non. Because if you remember, the way you structure a bibliography entry is by surname and initial. If you have no surname, you can't do that. So the way you get around it, anon, stands for anonymous. So here's some examples of what I mean by how you fill in your bibliography entries. So here's one. You can see how it follows the generic format that I've spoken about. And this is a nice, neat one that fits quite well. Because what you've got is you've got two authors, you have the year, you have the title of the publication in italics, you have the place of publication, and you have the publisher. So it fits the formula perfectly. It's nice and easy. Here's one that doesn't quite fit that generic formula because it's a different kind of media. And this is for a journal article. But it still follows the same generic format, but with a couple of subtleties. And this is where the guides give you the precise details of the subtleties. So you've still got the author, their initial, the year, and the title of the article. But now what you have is the name of the journal in which it appeared, and the volume number, and page number. You don't need to give the page number for the books. You only need to do that when you're talking about a journal or an article. And here's a couple of variations on website type ones that you would approach. And there's a couple of points here that I want to pull out from it. So first of all, with these ones, you have an author. So you still give the author's name. No change there. Or alternatively, an organisation if you don't know an individual that wrote it. But then what you do is you give the full URL. And you can see here how some of these URLs are very, very lengthy. You would not be wanting to put that into your in-text citation, which is why your in-text citation would just have Smart Insights 2014. But your bibliography entry has the full details of it. So the full URL goes in the bibliography. And what you also give with the bibliography entry for a website is this, the date when you accessed it. So if you think about what happens with the website, it regularly gets updated. So you might have given a reference for an entry in a website which took place 6 years ago, and that URL might now be different. So if me, as the person wanting to check your work, wanted to check that citation or that entry, and I went to look for it, that URL might no longer work because the person that owns the website has changed it. As is expected. Yeah, it's a perfectly normal, natural thing to do. They keep it updated. So what you then have to do is you have to give the date when you accessed the website information, because you're acknowledging that that URL might not be there now. It might have changed. It might be different. So that's why with a website you give the URL, or you give the date accessed for it as well. And here's another example of one from a website approach. This time, anon. So this is one where you genuinely do not know who the author was that produced that particular documentation. You might know the organisation, but that can be difficult. In this case, it's the UK government. It feels a little vague. You haven't necessarily got any specifics here. But what you've got instead is you do it this way. So you don't know the author, but you do then give the name of the organisation. And there's the URL, where you got the item from, and there's the access date, so that anybody can look it up and go, oh yeah, see what you mean. So if we were to look back through the archive of that website, and we saw what that URL looked like on that date, we would find that piece. So that's how you would address that. Another final point I want to highlight about bibliography entries. You don't need to give a bullet pointed list in a bibliography. You literally just structure it by the surname of the first named author. And that's all you need to give. You don't need to give numbers, you don't need to give dashes, you don't need to give bullet points. It's literally just the entries as are shown here. So, let me just summarise what I've spoken about there then. So remember that the purpose of referencing is to give credit to people that have done things that wasn't you. You're showing that you've worked on other people's work and you've built it and developed it. There are different standards. The one that we use is Harvard. So there's rules laid down for an organisation using Harvard. That's the guides that you follow that are available on OtsCom Learning and via whichever professional institute it is you're working from. There's two elements to referencing: in-text citation, author year, and then the full details of it contained within the bibliography. That's the broad principles of it. And remember, do it on an ongoing basis rather than waiting until you've finished the document, because it can be really, really hard to try and go back and find everything that you did before. Okay, I'm going to stop talking at that point then, but what I am going to do now is I'm going to hand over to the chat facility and I'll pick up any questions that might have come up, and I'll do it via the chat facility. But I will pick up one that's just been asked here via the chat facility. How do you reference OtsCom Learning slides? Generally what you find is that the slides have a citation on the slides. It'll either be at the bottom or it'll be contained within the references list that comes at the end of the slide deck. So rather than referencing the OtsCom Learning slides, what you do is you reference whoever the slides have been produced on the basis of. It's a bit like the Roberts, Cited and Smith approach. So rather than giving OtsCom Learning, what you do is you give the person that the slides have been built on. So if the slide is about Porter's 5 forces, for example, it's the reference for Porter's 5 forces, which should be in the references list at the end of the slides. Hopefully that answers the point, Vicky. If there is any situation where that doesn't actually apply, then the thing to do is to contact your tutor, because it might well be that perhaps the slides themselves are not as fully up to date as they should be, and therefore the college then has to update them. So we'd need to have a look at that and just investigate it. There is another point related to that as well, is that sometimes what we do as a tutor is we pull together multiple applications of something, if you like, in order to communicate it as effectively as we can for learning purposes. So sometimes we have a composite slide where we've pulled together multiple things which try and illustrate the point that we're talking about. In those sort of situations, you will find that what we've been talking about is either contained within the references lists or within one of the textbooks. And that's where you would then reference the textbook where that piece that we've pulled together has come from. And hopefully that addresses that. I'm going to need to rephrase that question that's just been asked there, because there is no Harvard acceptance, if you see what I mean. Harvard is not an organisation that accepts websites. It's the institution that you're producing the assignment for that accepts it as to whether it's a credible reference point. Now, the other point I would suggest about that is it depends on what you mean by credible. The point is, if you have gathered information from somewhere, then you have to give a reference for that somewhere that you've got it from. So there will be a citation for anywhere that you've collected it from. I think what you're asking, really, the root of the question is using something like Wikipedia or an individual person's blog, is that classed as being reliable enough for a professional institution? So it's not that it's accepted by Harvard, it's whether it might be accepted by the Chartered Institute of Marketing, for example. Again, I'll rephrase that question, because it's not that it's acceptable, and it's not that it's unacceptable. It's more that things like Wikipedia, for example, or individual blogs have not been what's called peer-reviewed, which means that somebody else has looked at it and says, yes, I agree, this information is correct. So something like Wikipedia, for example, can be edited by anybody, so you can't rely on it. An individual blogger writing about something is just an opinion. It's just their opinion. Therefore, you can't rely on it. But it doesn't mean that you can't use it in order to help you formulate your own ideas. And I'll be honest, sometimes if I'm wondering about something and I don't know how it actually operates or I don't know what it means, I'll look up Wikipedia. And then I'll look up Wikipedia and I go, oh yeah. Now I know what it means. Now I can see some of the places that Wikipedia has referenced, so I will go to those pages. Because those places, the original author's site or the original author's textbook or the original article where it came from, that is what will be viewed then as being peer-reviewed, i.e. reviewed by other professionals, and therefore considered to be credible. It is a valid place that people will look at and say, yeah, that sounds acceptable. So, if you had a reference from Wikipedia, for example, or an individual blogger in your assignment, you're not going to fail because of that. You're not going to fail because you got one. But if that is all that you had, what you would have done is you would have created the impression that you haven't done a robust and thorough analysis on a range of different sources, pulled together information from those different sources, and then built an assignment accordingly based on that range of different sources. Now, hopefully that answers the point. It's not that there's a separate body called Harvard that views it as being acceptable. And it's not that any one site is credible or not credible. It's a case of using it for what it gives. I read Wikipedia, I read individual blog writers. They help me to think about things. If I use that, I'll give them credit for helping you to have thought about it. But if I'm doing a professional academic assignment, I will use a range of different sources, many of which are viewed as being accepted within the industry. For example, something that's available via EBSCO. Then you know that it's going to have come from a peer-reviewed approach, and therefore you can draw on that type of aspect of it. Okay? So I'm going to stop talking now, but I will leave the chat facility open in case anybody's got any other questions that they want to ask, and then I'll ask them via the chat facility.